Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Latest update on the Max Verstappen to Mercedes rumours. Reports suggesting that yes, Red Bull getting rid of Christian Horner was at least to some degree targeted at trying to convince Max Verstappen to say, but that does not mean by any means that's actually what's going to happen. Top brass at Red Bull are still very concerned that Max may well sign a contract with Toto over the coming weeks. A decision is expected over the coming weeks, but maybe there is some reason to believe that George Russell is confident he is going to get an extension as well. Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. Also, big thanks for 80,000 subscribers. I think we hit that number over the last couple of days. 20,000 to go until the big one. Trying to get another plaque behind me on the wall, however, for another channel. But honestly, do really appreciate the support this year. I think at the start of the year, we had maybe 60-ish K. We're roughly halfway through the year. We've got to 80. So, you know, I'm just saying if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd appreciate it. Let's get on with the discussion. Now, Ben Sulleyam's at it again. I think Toto made some interesting comments today, suggesting that, yeah, Ben Sulleyam's, let's say, ruling with an iron fist, but that has its pros and its cons. Now, he is convinced, it seems, Ben Sulleyam, that a return to V8s is going to happen. The question, of course, would be when. There was talk about as early as 2028, and then there was talk about as early as 2029. We're probably thinking maybe 2030, but Ben Sulleyam seems to be pushing hard for it. I think many of the teams and the manufacturers will also be on board with this type of conversation. Some, though, won't, and you need a super majority if you're going to make any decision like that actually stick. A few driver market things. We saw yesterday rumours that Lawson is going to retain his Racing Bull seat for next year, but I think that's very much up in the air as it stands, because the Lindblad, the Verstappen, Tsunoda, Hadjar, all the conversations are currently circling around that team. And also, with regard to Sergio Perez, Verstappen gave a pretty ringing endorsement of his teammate Perez for the Cadillac seat. We know that Verstappen was actually very, defensive when it came to criticism of Perez during their time as teammates. And a lot of it, especially in hindsight, proves to be rather understandable indeed. So Perez has taken a year out of the sport. He wouldn't have liked to, but he was forced to because Red Bull paid off his contract. Maybe that was one of the decisions for which Christian Horner has lost his job, but Perez has actually done very well from the year out, and he is likely to be back on the grid next year. There were some rumours linking him to Alpine, actually, but there's other drivers linked there as well, and who knows what Flavio Briatore is going to cook up. So the Cadillac seat is an option. There's talk, of course, about Perez. There's talk about Bottas. There's talk about Zhou Guanyu. There's also talk to some degree about Yuki Tsunoda, right? There are rumours that Tsunoda and Mick Schumacher, outside candidates to join Cadillac. It gets pretty interesting when it comes to Toto Wolff's driver stable, right? Because, as we know, Mick Schumacher's kind of under that umbrella. What happens to George? What happens to Kimi? We know that Bottas maybe is going to be on the way to Alpine, possibly. That's a rumour that was discussed even mid-season. There was a discussion that maybe Bottas to Alpine could be a thing instead of Colapinto. If that happens, I think Perez would be very confident indeed he's getting the Cadillac drive. But it does seem like there are a few plates that are spinning right now, certainly from the Mercedes perspective, because, Mick is still to some degree involved. I think obviously he's driving for Alpine right now in WEC, but there's talk about, Toto's involvement there with the drivers. Esteban Ocon seems relatively stable in his spot at Haas for the time being, but there's the Bottas question, there's the Mick Schumacher question, and there of course also are the major questions internally at Mercedes right now, featuring this man on the left-hand side. Now, I thought this was pretty funny today, because George Russell has put on one of his favourite pinstripe double-breasted jackets and has picked up a yacht. Now, understandably, lots of the drivers and the team owners and all this stuff, they have nice boats, right? Because of course they will. It maybe doesn't mean that much, but he's purchased over the last couple of days a new Pershing 6X yacht, and we'll have a look at it in a second. But as Steph says, you don't buy a yacht unless you've got a fat contract incoming. Now, I don't know if we want to read anything into this. Would he buy the yacht if he was convinced that his contract wasn't going to go anywhere next year? I don't know, right? Like, it's the type of thing that I would do had I just signed a new deal with Toto, right? I'm just saying, if I'd just signed a new Mercedes deal for a 2+1 or something for the next couple of years to the value of 30 million euros a year, then hell yeah, I'm going to go out and get myself a Pershing 6X yacht. This is the yacht, for reference, if you guys are interested in what Russell's picked up. I don't know what these are brand new. I'm not especially familiar, I will say, with the luxury yacht market, although I don't know if the Christian Horner news continues, maybe I'll have to. But the point is, I think these are like 3 million quid, something like that. I think you can get them second hand for a couple of mil. So anyway, if you guys are in the market, then feel free to inquire. Thought I'd send my details in. But yeah, it's a pretty funny advert here, really. Not really seen too many luxury yacht adverts. This is one of them. So anyway, this is George Russell's yachts, basically. The point that I'm trying to make is, it's not a paid advertisement, is it? The point I'm trying to make is, would George Russell have bought this yacht because he signed a new deal? Probably it's irrelevant, but it's something to talk about, right? And maybe it's another yacht that will be at a track, because we know that Max Verstappen's got his jet and he's got his yacht. Toto Wolff's got his yacht. They were spotted in Sardinia. With this on the market, we're going to see even more. Oh, George Russell, off he goes to Sardinia. Who's he meeting with, right? What's going on there? So that's one part of the conversation. We'll get back to that in a second. Before we do, let's talk Ferrari. Mattia Binotto says, the current situation is not easy. These kinds of situations have happened quite often in recent years. Of course, he was critically involved in many of those scenarios. Ferrari hasn't won for a long time. Expectations are always very high. And if they're not met, because they're not, leads to disappointment among the fans. And of course, that trickles down even further than that. But it's a critical couple of days for Ferrari. Tomorrow is probably the most important day of their season so far, and it's not occurring at the track, it's occurring at Mugello, where of course we did race a couple of years ago, but there's going to be a 200-kilometre filming day. If you guys aren't familiar with this, the teams can do a filming day. Red Bull did one at Silverstone the other day with Lauren McKeith there for the first time, just for the sake of it really. But the advantage of running a filming day is that you have the opportunity to use different parts on the car. Now, I think there are some rules around what parts you're allowed to use. You might have to declare that you're going to use them in an upcoming Grand Prix in order that you actually can put them on the car for the filming day. But the point is that Ferrari have a new rear suspension on the way, and this is the big one. They changed their floor a few rounds ago, but there's been a major conversation. We thought this new rear suspension was going to arrive for Silverstone. There were some rumours that it wasn't correlating properly, and that's why it was delayed. But Giuliano De Kester and the guys at Auto Racer said that wasn't true, to my understanding. So who really knows what's happening? What we do know is that Ferrari has an issue with the rear ride height. That's the belief. It's not necessarily a massive issue with rear instability like the Mercedes had in previous years that Hamilton wasn't happy with. It seems to be the case that they can't run the car at the ride height they want at the rear with the suspension design that they cooked up for this season. They changed the front suspension notably this year, and it seems to have affected things mechanically with the platform of the Ferrari SF25. So they've got a brand new rear suspension. The intention almost certainly will be to put the ride height in a better position. Should mean less lift and coast, should mean they don't get disqualified like what happened back in China. So there's a few benefits, and of course the lower you can run the car to the grounds, you can gain another couple of tenths by that easily, and if it's a couple of tenths of a second, that's going to put them right where they need to be. Because Ferrari and race trim have been reasonably competitive. In qualifying, they've just consistently, this car has been 2 to 3 tenths off where it needs to be to put the guys in the mix. So they've got a filming day tomorrow. And notably, of course, at this filming day, it's going to be both of their drivers. There was a rumour a few days ago that it was going to be Leclerc and Giovinazzi at the filming day, but no, it will be Leclerc and Hamilton in Mugello to probably have 100 kilometres each. So, a fair few laps. A Grand Prix distance is 300 kilometres. So each of the drivers will get 20 or so laps of the Mugello circuit with the new rear suspension to test everything out. So, it should be enough, I would imagine, for Ferrari to get the data that they need. Of course, they're just going there to film, right? It's just a filming day. Like, we're not doing anything else. We're just here to get some nice shots of the HP logo on the back of the car. So, yeah, there's going to be more to it than that. They're going to Mugello. They've probably got a specific reason to go to Mugello. They want to test it on that specific track. It is interesting because, if they went to some other tracks, like they could go back to Spain, I guess, and they could do it in Barcelona potentially, because that's a common testing track and they would therefore have a direct comparison point. You can't can't go to tracks where you're about to race. So they can't go to Monza, for example, because in the next couple of months we're going to race in Monza, so there's limitations on testing on tracks. Well, not testing, of course, filming day, on tracks that they're about to race at. So they have to be a little bit careful with the way that they do this. It's pretty cool for them to go to Mugello, to be honest, but they do have a specific aerodynamic setup ready to stress the new rear suspension, and they will get the feedback from Leclerc, they will get the feedback from Hamilton, and at that point they will then decide where they go from there. And the other discussion, as we saw, is then shifting their focus fully to 2026 after they lock this whole thing down. So let's talk about the Max Verstappen situation, because it continues to get rather dramatic. Gerhard Berger was talking about the focus should now not be on winning the World Championship again, it's to reintegrate the team, stabilize the team. Red Bull is clearly in a downward spiral, it's all about rebuilding effectively. Now he also says that the meeting with Toto, or maybe let's say not a meeting as he describes it, he thinks it was purely a coincidence that Max was in Sardinia. Now I don't know if I really believe this. I know people are looking at this and saying it's not going to age especially well. I just think the timeline, right? Max's jet took off from Nice at like 10 a.m. It arrived in Sardinia at midday and it left at 5 p.m. It's kind of tough to believe that Max just went for a day out at the beach, right? Like, there's plenty of nice things to do in Nice, I would imagine, no pun intended. So Max, I don't know. To me, it seems kind of doubtful that Toto seemingly was there. Max flew out there for 5 hours. I don't know. Coincidence? I kind of think not. But Max has always maintained that he wants to remain loyal to Red Bull, and I think that he will after Horner's dismissal. Now, the top part is true over the last 3 years. I would say that is less true over the last 3 months, right? Like, I think Max has been pretty clear over the last few months, really, when the championship has seemingly been slipping away to some extent, that he needed to be careful about what his future looked like. But the general consensus is that Horner's sacking had at least something to do with trying to maintain Verstappen in the team. Maybe even if only because the feeling was that the team was in a spiral under Horner and his leadership, and the friction that he had with so many internally, and it felt that the Verstappens were in a position where the team was in an maybe irreversible decline with Horner, and the only way to arrest that was to kick Horner out of the team, and maybe the Max Verstappen piece of the puzzle is more incidental, a secondary consideration, but it is certainly a consideration. Apparently Oliver Mintzlaff was the key figure. At the end of the day, he leads things up over at the Austrian side, pretty much the entire business. So of course he will be the man behind the dismissal, right? Because he literally is the one that makes the decisions at the end of the day. But who he was influenced by, whether this was his own decision totally, or whether there were other names in the room. Yesterday, of course, we heard rumours about the importance of Helmut Marko, reports that he was in plenty of the meetings in the run-up to Horner getting dismissed. And then there's the Jos Verstappen piece as well. It is common knowledge, as Eric Van Haren, who of course is pretty close to the Verstappens, that father Jos Verstappen was a big critic of Horner and warned at the beginning of last year that Red Bull would fall apart if the team boss stayed put. However, his influence should not be underestimated, but should not be overestimated. So, pretty interesting. You've got to understand that Van Haren, he talks to those guys quite a lot, so he's unlikely to come out and say, oh yeah, Jos did it, right? He was the mastermind, he's wanted him gone for a while, and he finally got his way and convinced him. So I think what he says is kind of telling to say that yes, Jos Verstappen was definitely involved. That's what this sentence means, really. It's like, yeah, don't overestimate the importance. It's not like Jos is the CEO, and fundamentally Max is more important than his father, you would think, in these decisions. But also making it clear that you should not underestimate his influence. And I think, as I've said over the last few days, it is also a discussion that is worth having for Mercedes to think, okay, Max Verstappen is Max Verstappen, but he also comes with Jos, and I don't know how Jos would feel and integrate into that Mercedes garage, right? Because, yeah, Jos isn't on the payroll, but he's always in the paddock, and he's always going to be giving his opinions, and even if not always publicly, although sometimes publicly, it can be destabilizing, right? We know that it can be destabilizing because Jos's goal is to put Max in the best position possible to win, which is commendable, right? But sometimes it comes at the cost of internal chaos. And I know that there's many fans out there that say, if you could keep Jos Verstappen away from the team, you probably would. But that's not really how things seem to be. The question then becomes, okay, Horner's gone. We think we know why he's gone. At least we know some of the reasons why he's gone. The timing is still a bit interesting, but where's Max going to go? Is this enough to keep Max at the team? Because Van Haren, as we say, drops a new article today discussing it and says that, yeah, there have been loads of rumours, but in reality, not much has changed since earlier this month. So earlier this month, before Horner was fired, when the feeling was that, and I think even Raymond Vermeulen, Max's boss, or not boss, his manager, make that clear, said, because it's the other way around, of course, but his manager said that for them it doesn't change anything. They're looking for performance. They want Red Bull to deliver that performance, and, you know, he didn't really say much more than that, but I think the implication was relatively clear that if the situation competitively at Red Bull doesn't improve, it's not at all guaranteed that Max isn't going to walk out the door anyway. So that's been the big rumour, and yeah, there were talks with Toto. Unlikely there do continue to be talks. Van Haren says that just because there were talks, it doesn't mean that necessarily an imminent deal is in the pipeline, but what it does seem to mean is that Red Bull are still pretty concerned about this. They didn't have the guarantee from Max by any means that, okay, if you get rid of Horner, I'll stay. That was not said, that was not implied, and maybe the reverse of that was implied, as in, if you keep Horner, I'm going for sure. I wouldn't be surprised if Jos was telling Mintzlaff that, and as a result, you know, the decisions were made, and Mintzlaff wanted Horner gone anyway, but the point was to convince the Thai side of the ownership. I don't know, still very fascinating. But as far as my belief is that Red Bull management were informed that if Horner was to stay, then it was almost guaranteed that Max would go. They were not necessarily said the other way around, but of course it would improve their chances, let's say. So that's what's interesting, that the decision is still expected to be made shortly. The run-up to Spa-Hungary in the next week or so, couple of weeks, then the summer break. We are expecting a decision within a month, really, from Max, and that might potentially become public. But it doesn't feel like Red Bull are satisfied with, okay, we got rid of Horner, we're fine, right? Max is going to stay for at least another year, we can prove ourselves to him. That does not seem at all guaranteed right now. So, yeah, very interesting. Horner out means Max stays. That does not seem to be true, and Max still has a decision to make. Red Bull have put their cards on the table and they said, okay, Max, you know, we think you wanted this, so here it is, and maybe please stay because we really need you. And then Max will decide over the next few weeks what he actually wants to decide to do, and Toto will be waiting for the call, or maybe making the phone call himself if that maybe will be necessary. So intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Just a couple of final things. Qualifying gap to the fastest. McLaren haven't taken every pole, so their gap is not zero, but it's very close to zero. But in terms of percentage terms, it's pretty impressive how impressive the McLaren has been in qualifying, because in, let's say, the Red Bull from 2023, the RB19, most dominant machine in terms of race victories that we have seen. I think a lot of that was because the rivals really dropped the ball that season, but it was also an incredibly impressive car. Impressive to such a degree that there have been various theories over the last couple of seasons about ways that things might have been done slightly counter to the rules. But we know that in that season, the Red Bull was not always on pole. Ferrari took numerous pole positions, but in race trim, they were just untouchable. And McLaren this year have a similarly strong race pace advantage. They can look after the tyres seemingly in a way that no other team is able to do, but they're also able to convert that to qualifying performance. I think what you see a lot of, like, I mean, I don't know what the numbers are on this, but I would hazard a guess that McLaren this year in qualifying between their two drivers have the most purple sector 3s of anyone. I mean, of course they will, they're the fastest team, but more so than sector 1, sector 2. That's just, I don't know what the numbers are. If someone wants to run the numbers on that, I'd actually be fascinated to know. But the theory is anyway, that at the end of the qualifying laps, the McLarens are able to hold on to their tyres, even over a quali lap, which maybe says something about Pirelli, better than anybody else. And that's a big gap, right? I mean, to Red Bull, to Max, the gap is, 0.37%. To Mercedes, 0.5 percentage point. To Ferrari, 0.6 of a percentage point. It's a big deal. Williams, Racing Bulls, Alpine, Aston Martin, Haas, Sauber. That is technically the order of qualifying performance so far this year, but it's, it's pretty tight cut, and, well, we'll see if that changes from now to the end of the season. Just one final comment on the fact that Lando Norris, interestingly enough, has, despite the questions about him, and you could argue that in Silverstone he was rather lucky with the penalty for Piastri and all this, but there have been 3 races so far this year that have been in the wet, and Lando has won all of them. So, just maybe something to think about. I know that obviously Charles Leclerc was getting some criticism the other way, that he's had a difficult time in the wet. Like, is that on Leclerc necessarily? Is that on the way that he sets the car up that doesn't work in the rain? I think that's probably part of it. The Miami sprint maybe was kind of unlucky, but still a mistake that you don't want to be making. So anyway, just a few talking points to keep you guys entertained for the evening. But very much interested to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.